Hello and welcome to Heroic Media. I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. This week in Heroic Media, the birth rate in the United States reaches an all-time low.
A woman in Brazil saves more than 3,000 babies from abortion.
It is no longer illegal to feed the homeless in Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Stay tuned for all these stories and more here on Heroic Media.
So here at Heroic Media, we discuss headlines that deal with issues of family, marriage, and life. And we focus on those because they're the very building blocks of our society. They're very foundational to everything else in the culture.
Yes, and a lot of times the stories will revolve around topics such as abortion, euthanasia, embryonic stem cell research, human cloning, and homosexual marriage.
Exactly. So, Patrick, what's our first story for today?
All right, in our first story, a new report shows that the U.S. birth rate reached an all-time low in 2013. The birth rate had been on a decline for 6 straight years since its peak in 2007. So I find the birth rate topic kind of interesting.
Very interesting.
I'm kind of somewhat of a numbers guy. Yeah. So this is what I find interesting, right? There was 3.93 million babies born in 2013, and the population of the United States is like something like 300 and something million. So I find how it's just such a small percentage of the population. So it's like, you can see like, I just find the trends interesting with how many, the different demographics and you know, how many people are in all these different age groups and you know, how fast they're coming. So anyway, it's been declining for the past 6 years.
Yeah.
Since 2007. In 2007, it was a record-breaking 4.32 million babies born. And so what were your reactions to the findings and kind of, I know there's a lot of data, so you don't want to hit everybody over the head with all these stats, but.
Sure, I thought it was interesting. There were 2 things that struck me. First of all, just that the overall numbers of births are declining.
Yeah.
And second of all, that if you look at the actual age groups, that's not necessarily the case for all of them. So overall, there's this decline for the last 6 years.
Yeah.
But the birth rate is declining for women under age 30, but it's actually rising for women over age 30.
Yes.
And in fact, for ages 35 and higher, we're at the highest birth rate we've seen in over 50 years.
Exactly.
So I think if we look at, and this report is just giving data. They aren't doing a bunch of studies and surveys and asking people why they're not having kids.
Yep.
But I think there's a lot of possible explanations. We have perhaps the economy. We know that people are delaying marriage, delaying buying a house. So it could be that they're delaying childbirth too.
Absolutely.
And it also could be pressures on women to advance in their careers, and so they're holding off on having kids.
Yep.
Particularly with things like IVF, there's the ability for women to get pregnant later on in life.
Yep.
So that might be why we're seeing more and more people having babies at higher levels after age 30, 35.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I found that very interesting, and I felt like it's in line with exactly what you were saying, what you see everyday life, you know, with people, regular everyday people, that people are having children later. And I think some of the other reasons that women, the reason that older women are having more babies, I think you hit the nail on the head with that, right? They're focused on their career and everything, and so that's why they're having babies later. Then the women under 35, the birth rate is really dropping there, and I think that obviously there's so many different reasons, but I think a lot of it has to do with just the general idea and viewpoint of and value or lack of value rather, that are placed on having families and children. And so I think a lot more people are saying, I don't want a family, or there's kind of like this push, it seems like, in society where you have to go live your dreams, go quote unquote live your dreams, travel the world. Kids are never a part of that, it seems like, right? It's like go out and have your fun or whatever, and then by the time people kind of settle down, or whatever you want to call it, they may maybe go, I'm too old to have kids, or I don't want to have kids, or
or if you do have kids, a lot of times the goal is 1 child or 2 children, but definitely not more than 2.
No more than 2 children. Boy and a girl.
A boy and a girl, yeah. So if you are having kids, it could be that it's declining. I also thought that the reaction from some of the demographers was interesting. The people who are doing the demographics, they're basically saying, don't worry about this, it'll get better when the economy improves. And besides, we're not as bad as Europe. That was sort of their response.
Yeah,
Europe has very, very, very troubling falling demographics,
yes,
they're actually not able to replace the populations that are dying, and
yep.
so that creates a huge social problem there.
Absolutely. Yeah, I thought that was one of the interesting facts too. So the birth rate, as I mentioned earlier, 126.8 per 1,000 in 1909, and then in 2013 it was 62.5 births per 1,000. So a significant drop.
That is significant.
We'll have to see how things pan out. Pretty interesting.
Absolutely. In our next story, she has been called the Angel of Rio. In the last 23 years, one woman in Brazil has saved the lives of more than 3,000 babies from abortion.
Pretty amazing.
Really, really incredible.
It's a great story for just showing like what someone might deem an average person. You know, the average Joe. She's just this, teacher that happened to ask. It was almost like providence, right? That she was being called for this, in my opinion. But she's done such a wonderful job.
Absolutely.
And it's just amazing how much grace is available in these very impoverished areas, and how much they just need somebody to step up like Doris did, and go out there and just meet people where they're at. She literally goes right out inside of these clinics, clinics as she calls them.
Right.
So
right. Really incredible story. So this woman, her name is Doris. Living in Brazil. She was a history, geography, and counseling teacher for grade schoolers. The principal of her school asked her if she could help with some girls who were suffering the aftermath of abortion.
Right.
So she says yes. This is not necessarily the work that she has been doing. This is certainly not her profession.
Yep.
And then it just sort of evolved over time. She started out passing out pro-life materials, and then she started praying the rosary while she was passing out pro-life materials. And then eventually she started really focusing on women from the slums who had had abortions.
Yes.
And these slums, I've actually been to Brazil. I've been to Rio before, and so just driving, we didn't go into the slums because it's not particularly safe for foreigners, but just driving past them, you can really see the suffering. It's very, very poor. I mean, it's not really what we think of when we think poverty. It's a whole different level of poverty.
Wow.
And so there's a lot of problem with addictions. It's an incredible amount of suffering and poverty that's very visible. And so these women, when they go in for abortions, it's often drug addictions. It's often they're being pressured. And she sort of describes some of this.
Yeah.
But in Brazil, abortion is illegal in most cases. So these women are going to get sort of back alley illegal abortions.
Exactly.
That's a whole separate question. But in this case, she's standing outside of these clinics and she's watching for these women and just trying to offer them resources and offer them support and offer them help.
Right. Yeah. A lot of times they feel like they have no other choice but to go have an abortion. So she really offers the voice of, hey, there's another way out. And what I really liked about this story and just about her and her philosophy, she says, she offers support to these people as well. So I think so many times we get the picture in society that, abortion, pro-life supporters tend to be these people that are just like outside of a clinic going, you're a sinner and you're going to hell and blah, blah, blah. Or you'll get the other group of people that say, well, you just want to, help them not to have an abortion, then you just leave them, you leave the baby, you completely abandon taking care of them or anything. But this is yet another example. You find that that's not really the case in most circumstances, right? And so just like Heroic Media, and she opened her own little business helping out these people. She found that people just kept coming back and back and back to her. She started out with, hey, let me rent this house. She found this handicapped woman, mentally handicapped and physically handicapped woman who was pregnant, living under a bridge, and she said, I want to help this lady out. And so she went and rented a house, brought her into the house, and basically helped her get on her feet and helped her out, helped her get things straightened out. And I think that that's the key. It isn't just this, I'm against abortion and then you're done. Like, I think to really make a difference, you have to get out there and meet people on their level and help them out, and that's what she does.
Absolutely, I think that's really key. And to see the way that it grew, she started it with this one house for helping out this one woman, and then more people came, and it became what's called the House of Assistance. And one thing that I thought was really neat is that many of the women who she reached out and helped are now volunteers there with her ministry, and so they're giving back, and just the way that it grows. And you really think about how much each of us can do. One little person making the difference. We all are called to do different things. She quit her full-time job 8 years ago and as a teacher, and now works exclusively with this ministry. Maybe we're not all called to do that, but we're all called to do something.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you look at the 3,000 lives that she's changed. Think about it. Think about 3,000 lives. Each of those people has a calling and a vocation, and they can go out into the world and serve God and do some kind of good. That's really powerful.
Absolutely. It is very, very powerful. And some of the things that her clinic does, or pro-life center does, is, you know, they get, these pregnant women can get medical care, professional training, they have a place to work, they can live their life with dignity, and meet the needs of their baby. So she really helps it, and I think you already mentioned that the volunteers, you know, these women that have been helped by these pro-life centers, they want to come back and volunteer, and I think that speaks, you know, volumes to how they feel about it, right?
Absolutely.
Because they are not just there to get some help and then, you know, run or whatever, go back into, you know, they're there they want to help. They've experienced something that's very powerful, and then they want to get back into it. So I think that's great. And one thing that I want to mention is that they also rely heavily on funds, and they really need some funds. And so I'm sure we'll put it up on the screen, but you can go to GoFundMe.com/hub 754, HUB 754. And so you can support them there too. I know they're in a very bad financial spot right now, but they're still able to help. I think they've already saved the lives of like 136 babies or something like that this year, in the bad economic state they're in.
Yeah, so you see they're relying on providence and how much they're really, really relying on God for everything. And this woman's putting her financial situation on the line for these people. So absolutely keep her in your prayers. Coming up, imagine being arrested for feeding the homeless. We'll have a guest with us to discuss it after the break.
Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Heroic Media. We're here with a special guest for this segment, Adam Urenik, the Director of Homeless Task Force with Christ in the City here in Denver, Colorado. Adam, thanks for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, and we're going to be discussing the story you may have heard. In Florida, a 90-year-old man was actually cited several times for feeding the homeless and was arrested. But for the time being, for right now, he can actually legally feed the homeless due to a judge's order who has lifted that ordinance for the time being. So this was quite the story. It was very shocking. Like, I remember when I first saw this story, I was like, oh, this can't be real. This can't be like this. They can't really be saying you cannot feed the homeless. It was kind of shocking to me. What were your initial reactions, especially since you work with the homeless on a daily basis?
My first reaction actually was not that much surprise.
Okay.
I think that this is actually something that mayors are talking about all over the country.
Right.
And that maybe Fort Lauderdale jumped the gun on what we're going to be seeing in other cities probably soon to come.
Exactly.
You know, I think what happened in Fort Lauderdale was kind of such a public relations disaster. Because it was an older gentleman.
World War II vet.
World War II vet,
right.
Going into pushing him in the back of a squad car. But certainly, people are looking for concrete results on how they can deal with the homeless problem, if you will.
Right.
And so that's one way that they've been seeing to do it. So.
Yep.
One thing that I thought was interesting was that if you looked at when they implemented this regulation, it sort of looked like it was well-intentioned, because it said that if you are going to be feeding the homeless, they're regulating the food temperatures that you're serving. They require bathroom facilities and hand washing stations. So it sort of seemed like an issue of health and safety for the homeless individuals. And so I thought that's interesting. Maybe are some of these measures intended to be for the good of the homeless population, and do they end up hurting them instead?
That's a really great question. I think that oftentimes when we bring up these hot button issues, that oftentimes it can kind of dissolve into like an ideological debate of you're against the homeless or you're against business or what have you. And I think that we need to have kind of calm, a collected way of approaching these things. So I thinking about the different goods that are at stake. You have, on the one hand, you have the goods of the homeless, and make sure that they're eating healthy food, that they're eating safe food, and that's obviously something that's really important. The other hand, you have the goods of the businesses that are around there as well. Is that stopping business there? They're paying taxes as well.
Right.
Then all the resources that are being offered for the homeless may be stopping as well. So there's also goods there. My first initial reaction to something like that is that it's a good initiative, but what I've seen in my own work is that oftentimes maybe a liability culture or a culture of that gets so caught up in the programming and the rules, sometimes charity gets snuffed out along the way. And I think that any organization, any city, any person needs to be thinking about, okay, are we allowing charity to reign here? Because ultimately we're trying to create a civilization of love. So, what does that look like? So.
Right, yeah, and that, I'm glad you guys mentioned that, because that's, I think, a lot of on Facebook and everywhere, social media, it seemed almost it was very surface level response, I thought. And so I think some people watching this program might find what you're saying surprising. But when you looked at it, they were just honestly trying to solve a problem. And the problem was there's obviously a lot of homeless people, and like you said, there's different sides to the story, right? Obviously we need to solve the problem of the homeless people, but also all these homeless people in these big downtown areas and parks and things like that were causing businesses to have problems, right? There was health concerns, like Michelle was mentioning. There was no place for them to go to the bathroom. There was unsanitary conditions. So it began affecting other people in bigger ways, and they have their business set up there too, and they have a right to have a clean, respectful environment where business isn't driven away, people aren't intimidated by drunk homeless people that might be in the area, etc. So yeah, I think just like you were saying, we just have to balance that and make sure that we look at everybody. And I think that we also need to focus on making sure that we're not just trying to take care of the homeless problem, so to speak, but that we're actually caring about these people. I think a lot of times this is very representative of a lot of society, like cities today, where until it becomes this horrible problem for other people that are making money or whatever, then and then of course it's this big. They're like, okay, we're going to put this law in place, and there's a big PR disaster and everything. So I think it may not have been implemented in the best way, and made this huge PR disaster.
Absolutely, and like I said, I really think it's important that I think that the Catholic Church has a wonderful, rich response to be able to enrich public debate about this, because I think if you don't have a rich view of the common good, basic principles such as the common good, subsidiarity, the dignity of the human person, it's a bit hard to kind of break onto these issues, and oftentimes it becomes a political debate, the rich against the poor, the right against the left, and what have you. And there are a lot of goods at stake here. But like I said, I really think it's an important, if I were to say what's a good approach to this, what I would say is that I think it's important to remember that we should be addressing poverty and not necessarily, or the other way around, addressing the poor, not necessarily poverty in the sense of eliminating the poor, because oftentimes the response to eliminating poverty is just eliminating the poor themselves.
Exactly, yeah.
Let's get these stinky people out of our way.
Exactly.
And we forget that they actually, in God's eyes, are exactly the same as you and me.
Yeah.
And so according to our response, it has to be one in which we're going to take into account their goods as well, and that they're represented. So I think it's really important that, and I wonder if cities and councilmen and the people who are making these types of decisions are thinking, okay, this is a human being.
Exactly.
And based upon them being a human being, am I doing all that I can in order to be able to help them out? Exactly. Businesses asking themselves, am I doing all that I can? If me walking down the street, am I doing all that I can to be able to help that person out? And helping that person out doesn't necessarily mean just giving them $5 or giving them money or what have you. It can mean maybe having a conversation, making eye contact, maybe informing yourself about different shelters that are in the area, informing yourself about the different resources. I mean, people have different availabilities, so I think it really depends upon the person, their personal situation. But I think we all need to ask ourselves, what am I doing for the poor? And until we really ask that question, we're going to come up with these maybe program responses. Where we're kind of looking for like the silver bullet program, which is going to eliminate homelessness. And what happens in the process is that what's what Pope Benedict talked about. It says even in the most just society, you're still going to need love. You still need loving personal concern. And so I think each person needs to ask themselves, what is my loving personal concern for people? And then we can come up with some practical, ways to be able to address the very complex, problem, which is homelessness.
Absolutely. Adam, you work with Christ in the City. Can you tell us a little bit about this ministry? What do you guys do?
Thank you for asking. Christ in the City is a program that I've been blessed to work with now for 4 years in Denver, Colorado. And we form college-age missionaries to work with the poorest of the poor. What we found really is our niche. Really the folks that nobody else wants to work with are the chronically homeless. And these are typically the folks that you're seeing out on the street corners and oftentimes have mental health struggles or addiction struggles, serious family problems, what have you, falling out, maybe getting out of the jail.
Right.
And so what we do is we train our missionaries to go out and meet with them twice a day and then begin to provide them a path towards basically a life that's in accordance with their humanity. So we try to get them housing, we try to get them the mental health counseling they need, we try to get them reconciled with God, actually bringing them to church. All these things that basically show them that they're worth the effort and that God loves them. And we've been doing that for 2 or 3 years now in terms of this work that we do with the task force, specifically within Christ in the City. And what we tell our missionaries is, just get one person.
Right.
You know, really focus on the person. And what happens is they get more than one person. So we found the program has worked, and that you can actually get, you know, the hardcore homeless, people who are considered service resistant, you can get them off the street, and you can do it with college-age people.
That's awesome. That's very exciting.
It's been a real blessing, a real miracle to watch. Yeah.
That's great. Well, thank you, Adam, so much for joining us in this conversation.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We really appreciate the work that you do, and you know, all the homeless obviously appreciate it as well. So keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
We'll have one more story after the break.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to Heroic Media. In case you're just joining us, I'm Patrick Cordova.
And I'm Michelle Bauman. In our final story, a 35-year-old man with brain cancer passed away recently. He drew attention in his last days and weeks for the way that he embraced life despite suffering. So 35-year-old Aaron Permort, he had brain cancer. He and his wife met, they started dating in 2010, and then he had a seizure, and he was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer the following year, and he had 2 surgeries to remove a tumor. But they went on to get married, have a baby, things were looking up for a while. Then, after a few years of being seizure-free, he had another seizure earlier this year while driving, and he blacked out and got into an accident. And so that's when they realized there was something wrong, and they realized that he was not going to have very much longer to live. And I think that is a critical moment when you realize that everything's been going fine for a while, and then all of a sudden, you know, to find out that you have cancer and that it's going to end your life. I think that's the way that you respond to something like that really defines, in a lot of ways, you know, a lot of your life. And he decided that with his last days and his last weeks, that he was going to hold on to a joy and a love, and that was really going to transform his life despite this suffering. So there's some really beautiful stories that come out of this. He threw his wife a surprise birthday party while he was in the hospital, one day after he had had surgery to remove a brain tumor. So can you just imagine
impressive.
The suffering and the fear that you would have as you're having this brain surgery, but to be thinking of someone else. And that's what we're called to do, to love, to think of someone else's good before our own. So I think this is a beautiful, courageous witness, a beautiful example.
Absolutely. He didn't let, you know, the fact that he was having the surgery, that he knew he was going to be dying very soon, he didn't let that weigh down so much on him that he's, you know, that he was like, I'm just going to sit here and mope around, you know. He was like, hey, I'm going to throw my wife this surprise party, you know. He's like, he wanted to continue on with life and live his life to the fullest. And so I really think that it's great that he did that. And another interesting thing about the story, I thought it was the way that it became sort of a little bit more well known was that his last seizure that he had earlier this year, he didn't know where his car was, and then they discovered that there was like a note in his pocket, and somebody had written on there, hey, I parked your car at the drugstore or whatever, and they were in search of trying to find who this person was, and lo and behold, they found out, you know, and that's how you know, they were trying to find this person, so that's kind of how the story became known. And so I like how it was, you know, they weren't trying to like publicize this or anything like that, but in trying to find, you know, this one good deed that happened where this police officer, it turns out, drove his car down the street, you know, and parked at the drugstore after he had the seizure and was taken to the hospital. You know, they found out who he was and thanked him and everything, but it got all this publicity. So I thought that was pretty interesting too, that it was kind of brought to light. I think that's that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and just the whole, you know, like you said, this often we don't hear about stories like this. It's a very private thing. But his wife actually traced it all in a blog, and she wrote in that blog, it's not a cancer story, it's a love story with some cancer. So what a beautiful perspective. And you know, Scripture tells us that perfect love casts out fear. And I think this is such a beautiful witness of following God's will for your life despite the fear. You know, there's all situations where we're scared of what could happen, but just trusting God and saying, I'm going to not be paralyzed by this fear. I'm going to trust in God and move forward despite it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have to do that every single day.
Absolutely.
You know, we have to. We can't let fear into our lives. Like, it's the small things that help us be able to overcome the big things like this. So for me, I have to, because when I think of this, I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I could, you know, that's just such a hard thing to overcome. I can't really speak to this from experience. But I think that we can do it every day in our lives by, you know, not giving into that fear and living a life of love every day.
Absolutely.
You know?
I think that's a very good takeaway from this.
All right. Well, that's it for this week on Heroic Media. Please join us next week for all the up-to-date news on the pro-life issues that matter to you.
Please feel free to write to us with any comments, questions, or news tips at news@heroicmedia.org.
And please visit our website at heroicmedianews.org, where you can check out more stories like the ones we discuss on this show.
That's it for today. Until next time, keep us in your prayers.
God bless.